In the past, I haven't had the best luck with digital-only video games, and I'm talking digital-only in terms of PSN and Xbox Live exclusives. Ages ago, we did the titles Halo Spartan Assault and Spartan Strike, and while they were only $5 a piece, and while I had more fun with them than the milkshake I could have bought for the same amount, I still remember being heartily disappointed since they were incredibly short and cheap twin-stick shooters. You just ran around a bunch of maps and shot a bunch of guys for various semi-important space reasons, as you do in these lands of first-person shooters. I'm reminded of them today because we have the PSN exclusive Dead Space Ignition, which seems to have been released at the same time as Dead Space 2, and for good reason. Do you guys remember back in 2016 when whoever at Bandai Namco or some other studio thought it was a brilliant idea to release the phone game Slashy Souls and claim that it was built as an advertisement for Dark Souls 3, and everyone hated it because it was a badly programmed piece of shit by people who couldn't program Dark Souls if they had an infinite budget? That's pretty much the situation we have here in 2010 and what may be the cause of the video game with the best subtitle choice in existence. Dead Space Ignition is billed as a prequel game to set up the events of Dead Space 2, and judging from this game, Dead Space 2 is concerned with another necromorph infection on a space station called the Sprawl, after he was recovered out in space by the government who screwed up Aegis 7. The game puts us in the shoes of Mr. Delisle, an engineer on the Sprawl who's essentially a general handyman of electronic devices, and his partner Sarah, who have a bit of a romantic history that's grinding its gears for some really dumb and stupid reasons. It's odd because Sarah seems like the outgoing type to make this relationship happen in the first place, but is also the person who's been putting it on hold for 6 months. It's better than the bullshit that the Gears of War series gives us, at least, about marriages between characters who have absolutely no feelings. Anyway, the game is basically Delisle and Sarah doing their jobs. They are told to go fix an elevator that's broken down in the Sprawl, along with a bunch of various other things like a lighting array or a unitologist shield generator, and this is where we get to the actual gameplay of this game. Hacking stuff. In Dead Space Ignition, you get handed 3 different types of timed puzzles that need to be done to hack these various devices and fix them. The first one is where you have to race against a bunch of other dots on a virtual racetrack that represent AI defense systems trying to prevent the hack, and this quote-unquote puzzle can be a lot of fun with a whole host of obstacles and a fast pace with it just tossing everything at you at once. But the massive problem is that Sumo Games, the quote-unquote indie developer this was farmed out to, thought it was a brilliant idea to have the racetrack rotate around all the damn time and put it at weird angles so you have no clue about which way you are supposed to be moving to keep going in a straight line. The next puzzle is a bit better because it's the puzzle game of this puzzle game. You are given a motherboard and are tasked to reflect light beams into specific receptacles. It gets harder as the game goes on, introducing things like combining light beams with projectors, exploding parts that remove parts you have, and ripping off components to open ways forward. It's the most solid of the 3 types of puzzles, as it's just the straightforward puzzle solving with enough of a time limit to give you time to make and fix your mistakes. Although at the end, these things get ridiculous, as instead of finding the correct answer, you have to invent a correct answer before time runs out. There's not just one way to get this thing done. And then there's the last one, which was just a terrible idea from start to finish: the antivirus battles. Now, I could see where the idea was. Sumo wanted to have some sort of tower defense game where you send out units to fight against an opposing border patrol, but the problem is that the game essentially boils down to a button mashing game. Sure, you're told what each unit on the board does, but the game board is so tiny and each enemy is so similar to each other, and after sending out the units you have no control of where they are going. The best strategy is just to smash your hand against the buttons and hope for the best. This puzzle gives you plenty of time, so even if you cock up royally, you may still have a chance to break the enemy's tower by accident. And you'd better enjoy these puzzles, player, because this is the only gameplay that you're gonna get. The only other thing in this game is a visual novel comic book where you watch the characters wander around and find more jobs while the necromorphs are tearing up the place. And since you both are just engineers on the station, you're barely involved in the infection at all. Hell, I laughed my ass off when one of the choices I was able to make in the game was between going the long way around to avoid the necromorphs or go the straight way and go in guns blazing. I told them to go straight through because there's no combat in this game, just cutscenes. So it doesn't matter how dangerous anything is in this game, the characters can pull out of any danger because they're gods. If you thought that playing the visual novel would liven things up because the game would give you something to do, then I also have to disappoint you. Throughout the game you get 2 choices, and that's it. Yes, Dead Space Ignition is literally a puzzle game tied ass to end with these comic book cutscenes that honestly look better than the original comic book for this series. I know that this is a cheapo PSN game that cost all of $5, but could you give me something that doesn't look like it was shit out by a developer rushing to meet the launch of the PSP? This looks like something a moderately budgeted YouTuber would put together, for God's sakes. The only other thing the game does is that Delisle sometimes gets cryptic messages from either the government or the unitologists relating to something or other, and that would have been intriguing if it had been more of all of 2 messages he got throughout the entire game. I mean, come on, Intelligence Systems guys figured this out back in TTYD, and those guys were making papercraft role-playing games by the time this existed. And the only other thing we've got today is that halfway through the game, Delisle's de facto girlfriend Sarah gets killed by the necromorph children, and that could have actually been a sad point in the game if Delisle had thought about it for more than 30 seconds. And then we get to the final reason this game was a horrible, terrible idea. You can platinum trophy the whole thing in under 2 hours. The tradition of the amazingly cheap, amazingly terrible digital-only game lingers on as Electronic Arts' grand attempt to advertise the release of Dead Space 2. After the death of Sarah, the player is left with 4 puzzles stapled together as the final thing to do, as Delisle is tasked by his mysterious overlord to release Isaac Clarke from hypersleep. There are so many other, better ways to get people hyped up for a game than releasing a shitty cash-in prequel thing with the entire budget of a Subway sandwich. You know, like those pre-rendered trailers that you like so much, EA? Otherwise, you end up making video games with no right to exist on their own. This game is such a cop-out that it literally should have just been used in Dead Space 2 on the disc, because as a chapter 1 of a larger game, it is somewhat acceptable. Even good, because the gameplay is intriguing enough for bigger and better things later on. You could have put in some nice challenging puzzles for the start of your precious game, but instead you end up making a joke of a title that does nothing for Sumo as a developer. It probably isn't going to hurt their reputation, because you could definitely tell that this was a job that they were just paid to do, and not something they actually threw effort, artists, or a budget into. What a way to totally kill my interest in Dead Space 2 right off the bat, Electronic Arts. At least next week, we'll be in the boots of Isaac Clarke again 5 seconds after this schlock ended, and end up solving more space problems as the sprawl continues to fall into the pits of hell. But until then, we'll cap this off with a totally unflattering scoreboard that it definitely deserves. And a not farmed out victory for gamers, because you definitely deserve it. See you next time for our next voyage.